The greatest empires of the ancient world fell to a nameless enemy from the waves. For centuries, the mystery of the sea peoples has haunted our understanding of history. By the end of this journey, you will see the collapse of the Bronze Age through new eyes, uncovering the fragile threads that hold any society together. We will investigate who these shadowy mariners really were and why they disappeared without a trace. What does the fate of a civilization 3,000 years old say about our own world today? This world of grand palaces and bustling ports was held together by a delicate web. For centuries, a remarkable system of trade and diplomacy linked empires from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea. Kings exchanged letters on clay tablets, addressing each other as brothers. Ships carried not just goods like copper, tin, and luxurious glass, but also ideas, art, and technologies. It was in many ways the first international age, a vibrant network of civilizations that felt both ancient and surprisingly modern in its connections. Yet this very interconnectedness, this reliance on long, fragile supply chains across land and sea, also became its greatest weakness. The system was stable only as long as everything else remained stable. And in the late 13th century, before the Common Era, everything began to change. A changing climate brought prolonged droughts and poor harvests. Resources grew scarce and tensions between powerful kingdoms simmered. The foundations of this glittering age were quietly rotting from within, though from the outside the palaces still shone. All it would take was a single, powerful shock to bring the entire structure crashing down. That shock arrived not with an earthquake or a plague, but with the sight of strange sails on the horizon. The first and most enduring mystery is the most basic one. Who were they? Ancient Egyptian inscriptions, carved in stone to celebrate pharaohs' victories, provide our only contemporary list of names. They speak of the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, the Weshesh, and others. These are not the names of nations we recognize from the history books. They are ghost names, echoes of identities lost to time. Were these groups a unified army with a single purpose, a grand coalition of sea raiders, or does the truth lie in a far more chaotic and human story? Imagine not an invasion, but a great, desperate migration. As droughts crippled harvests and kingdoms imploded, countless communities were set adrift. Farmers, herders, and coastal villagers, their homelands gone, took to the sea in anything that could float. They became refugees, then scavengers, and finally, out of sheer need, raiders. Some scholars look at the names and see connections to later peoples, suggesting the Peliset may have become the Philistines of the Bible, settling on the coast of Canaan. Others trace potential origins to the shattered world of the Mycenaean Greeks or the fallen Hittite Empire in Anatolia. There are even theories linking them to islands like Sardinia or Sicily. But without a single written word from the sea peoples themselves, without a city we can point to as their capital, we are left assembling a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. We sift through pottery styles that appear in new lands, analyze the design of a sword found in a ruined port, and read between the lines of Egyptian propaganda. They are defined entirely by the fear they caused in others, a shadow cast by the firelight of burning cities. This turns their identity into a profound historical detective story, one where every clue is indirect and every answer only deepens the intrigue. But if their names are lost, their impact is carved in stone for anyone to see. The most chilling evidence comes from the walls of an Egyptian temple called Medinet Habu, built by Pharaoh Ramesses III. These are not just records, they are propaganda designed to show the pharaoh's divine power, and what they show is terrifying. We see chaotic naval battles with Egyptian archers firing from decks at strange, bird-headed ships. We see land battles with prisoners bound and presented to the king. But most telling of all, we see ox carts loaded with possessions, and families, women and children traveling alongside the warriors. This is the core of the second great mystery. These were not hit-and-run pirate raids. The scale and nature of these attacks suggest something far larger, a migration of entire peoples on the move. They struck coastal cities across the eastern Mediterranean, yes, but their reach went shockingly inland. One of the greatest powers of the age, the Hittite Empire with its formidable capital of Hattusa, fell. And Hattusa was not a port city. It was a fortress deep in the rocky highlands of Anatolia, hundreds of miles from any coast. How did a seafaring force topple such an inland stronghold? The answer points to a cascade of disaster. The sea peoples may have been the spark, or perhaps just one wave in a larger flood. They could have shattered coastal trade and sowed chaos, cutting off the Hittites from vital supplies and allies. Or, as some inscriptions hint, they may have joined with other displaced groups and inland rebels, creating an overwhelming tide of unrest that even mighty walls could not withstand. This movement had an unprecedented organization to it, a terrible purpose. Were they merely seeking plunder? Raiders do not bring their families. Were they seeking new land? The ox carts suggest they brought everything they owned, ready to settle. Or were they, above all, seeking survival, pushed from their homelands by famine and collapse, and now pulling down other civilizations in their desperate search for a place to live? This transforms them from a mysterious enemy into a heartbreaking symbol of that era's crisis, a complex, desperate surge of humanity that did not recognize ancient frontiers because hunger and displacement know no borders. These carvings at Medinet Habu are our closest encounter with the sea peoples, yet they speak in a voice of pure triumph. The hieroglyphs declare a decisive victory, a gift from the gods to their chosen pharaoh. We see the chaos of battle rendered in perfect, orderly rows, Egyptian archers standing firm on their ships, while their strange, feathered enemies fall into the water. The captives are depicted with hands bound, their exotic features and headdresses carefully detailed, a testament to their otherness. This is a masterpiece of state propaganda, designed for eternity to show Ramesses III as the unshakable defender of cosmic order against the forces of chaos. But the most revealing detail is not in the imagery, it is in the very existence of the monument itself. Why would the wealthiest, most powerful empire of its day go to such extravagant lengths to commemorate a battle against what they called mere bands of foreigners? You do not build a temple to celebrate swatting a fly. The sheer scale of this artistic and architectural project, the obsessive repetition of these scenes across the walls, tells us something the hieroglyphs do not say outright. It tells us of profound, bone-deep fear. The Egyptian state, a civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years, felt its entire world was at stake. The reliefs show not just warriors but families in ox carts, a moving population. This suggests the Egyptians understood they were not fighting a simple raid, but a migration, a tidal wave of humanity that threatened to wash away the very borders of their realm. So while we cannot take the Egyptian account as unbiased history, we can read it as a symptom. The feverish grandeur of their response is a thermometer measuring the intensity of the crisis. It gives names to the shadows, the Peliset, the T, Jekka, the Denyen, and freezes a moment of violent contact in stone. To understand the sea peoples, we must look past the pharaoh's boastful narrative and listen to the anxiety carved between the lines, the silent admission that even the mightiest kingdom of the age was brought to the very brink. Yet the story carved in stone tells only half the truth. To understand the full force of the wave, we must look beyond the battlefield to the sky and the soil. The third great mystery of the sea peoples is not about their swords, but about the world that forged them. What if these feared invaders were not the cause of the collapse, but one of its most dramatic consequences? Emerging science is painting a stark new backdrop for this ancient drama. By studying the rings of ancient trees and the layers of ice in distant glaciers, researchers have uncovered a hidden crisis. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the entire eastern Mediterranean region entered a period of severe and prolonged drought. Summers grew hotter and drier, rains failed, and rivers that had nourished civilizations for generations began to shrink. This was not a single bad harvest, it was a climate shift that lasted for decades, a creeping disaster that would reshape human destiny. Imagine the slow, grinding pressure of that reality. A farmer watches his fields wither year after year, grain stores dwindle, then vanish. The intricate trade networks that once brought food from fertile regions to bustling cities begin to fray, then snap. Famine follows. In such conditions, the delicate social contracts that hold a kingdom together, the loyalty of soldiers, the obedience of citizens, the authority of kings begin to dissolve. People are forced to make impossible choices. Do you stay and hope, watching your family face hardship? Or do you gather what you can and move, becoming part of a desperate search for survival? This is the likely origin story of the Great Migration. The Sea Peoples, in this light, were likely not a unified army with a grand plan, but a collection of shattered communities. They were farmers from Anatolia, herders from the Aegean, fishermen from coastal villages, all pushed from their ancestral homes by a changing climate they could neither understand nor control. Their movement then becomes a tragic domino effect. As one group was displaced, they moved into the lands of their neighbors who were also struggling. Conflict flared, some groups banded together for protection, their numbers swelling as they traveled. They followed the coasts and river valleys, the ancient highways of the world, because where there is water, there might be food. And when they encountered the walled cities and rich farmlands of still-functioning empires, what choice did they have? To them, the well-stocked granaries of Egypt or the trading ports of the Levant were not just targets for plunder, they were lifelines. The invasions we see in the Egyptian records were the final, violent symptom of a systemic illness that had been weakening the entire region for generations. The climate crisis broke the economic and political order, sending waves of displaced humanity crashing against the shores of any society still standing. So were the Sea Peoples aggressors, absolutely. But they were also refugees propelled by forces far greater than any single king or army. This reframes the entire Bronze Age collapse not as a war between civilizations, but as a failure of the environment that exposed how fragile even the greatest human achievements can be. It asks us a difficult question. When the foundations of the world itself begin to shift, what does any civilization, ancient or modern, truly have to hold on to? This brings us to a fourth mystery, one with a surprisingly clear answer. Of all the shadowy names listed by the Egyptians, one group steps out of the fog of history and into the light of archaeology and legend. The Peliset. Most scholars agree these are the very same people known in the Bible as the Philistines. This connection provides our single strongest thread, a rare chance to follow one band of sea peoples from their chaotic arrival to their lasting legacy. After the great battles depicted at Medinet Habu, the Egyptian records tell us something crucial. Pharaoh Ramesses III did not simply drive them away. Instead, he resettled them as garrison troops along the coast of Canaan, the land that would later become Israel. In a single strategic move, he turned a dangerous enemy into a buffer against other threats. These transplanted Peliset, now Philistines, built a powerful confederation of 5 cities, including famous places like Ashkelon and Gath, and here archaeology speaks volumes. Excavations at these sites uncover something startling. For a generation or two after their arrival, the pottery, the tools, even the architectural styles are not local. They are distinctly Aegean, echoing the cultures of the wider Mediterranean world, perhaps from places like Crete or Cyprus. we find loom weights for weaving that match those from across the sea, and cooking pots perfectly suited for preparing foods unknown in Canaan. This material evidence is like a cultural fingerprint confirming their foreign origin. They were strangers in a new land, clinging to the traditions of a homeland that was likely gone forever. Over time, of course, these traditions blended with local ones. Their distinctive pottery styles gradually faded, replaced by local forms. They adopted the language and gods of Canaan. But their identity remained distinct, remembered for centuries as formidable warriors and skilled metalworkers, the perennial rivals of the emerging Israelites. This transformation is profound. It shows us that the story of the Sea Peoples does not end with burning cities and naval battles. For some, it became a story of resilience and reinvention. They transitioned from being the terrifying force of collapse to becoming a settled, influential power, shaping the politics and culture of the region for generations. Their name, Philistine, would even pass into our language as a term for someone hostile to culture, a final, ironic twist from their ancient enemies. In tracing the journey of the Peliset, we see the full arc of this ancient crisis, from displacement and violence to settlement and legacy, proving that even the most destructive waves eventually recede, leaving new shapes on the shore. But if the Peliset found a home, what of the others? Among the most compelling theories is one that ties this entire crisis back to a world already familiar from legend. The Aegean Hypothesis suggests a direct link between the Sea Peoples and the dramatic fall of the Mycenaean Greek civilization. This is the world of Homer's heroes, of mighty citadels like Mycenae and Pylos with their towering stone walls. Yet around the same time the Egyptian pharaohs were fighting off invaders, these great palaces were burning. Their complex administration, their writing system we call Linear B, their entire political order, it all vanished within a generation. So what happened to the people? They did not simply disappear. The theory proposes that many, faced with famine and the breakdown of their society, took to the sea. Displaced Mycenaean warriors, skilled sailors, and their families may have become the very raiders the Egyptians recorded under names like the Ekwesh or the Denyen. This idea gains strength from subtle clues. The armor worn by some Sea Peoples in Egyptian carvings, with its distinctive horned helmets and figure-8 shields, bears a striking resemblance to the gear depicted in Mycenaean art. Even the design of their ships, with their high prows and bird-headed stems, echoes Aegean models. This theory reframes the entire narrative. It suggests the Sea Peoples were not an external barbarian force assaulting civilization from the outside. Instead, they were a symptom of a civilizational fever that was burning across the entire region. The collapse of the Mycenaean world, possibly triggered by that same climate-driven drought and internal strife, sent shockwaves of desperate humanity radiating outward. These groups then collided with other failing states, like the Hittite Empire, creating a domino effect of instability. One society's collapse became its neighbor's emergency. In this light, the Sea Peoples are participants in a vast, tragic chain reaction. They were both victims and vectors of the collapse, carrying the chaos of their ruined homelands with them as they sought new shores. This connects dots across the Mediterranean, turning a mysterious invasion into a recognizable human story of resilience and survival, however violent its expression. It asks us to see them not as a singular enemy, but as people caught in the whirlwind of history's most profound reset. While the Aegean connection is powerful, the map of possible origins stretches much further. Other compelling evidence points north to the rocky coasts of Anatolia and west across the open sea toward the islands of Italy. The names recorded by the Egyptians are cryptic, but they whisper of distant homelands. Take the Shekelesh, for instance. Scholars note a striking similarity to Sicily. The Shurden, with their distinctive horned helmets, bear a name that echoes Sardinia. These are not perfect matches, but they are tantalizing clues, suggesting that the crisis pulled peoples from the entire Mediterranean basin into its vortex. Could some of these groups have begun their journeys as far away as the Western Mediterranean, drawn eastward by rumor or by a chain of displacement? Simultaneously, from the north, another source seems likely. As the mighty Hittite Empire in Anatolia fragmented under pressure from famine and perhaps internal rebellion, it would have released a flood of displaced populations. These may have been Luwian-speaking peoples from the empire's coastal regions, suddenly without a state to protect them. They were skilled sailors and fighters, now adrift and desperate. This leads us to the most plausible picture of all, the multi-ethnic confederation theory. The Sea Peoples were likely not a single tribe or nation, but a coalition forged in crisis. Imagine the Mediterranean not as a series of separate kingdoms, but as a single, interconnected system breaking down. As one region failed, its people moved, colliding with others who are also on the move. Different groups from Anatolia, the Aegean, and perhaps even the Italian islands found common cause. Their bond was not shared language or heritage, but shared desperation and a shared need for land and resources. This theory elegantly explains the diverse cultural artifacts that archaeologists link to this period: pottery styles from here, weapon designs from there. It paints a picture of a melting pot of survival where disparate communities united under the stark banner of conquest. They were a patchwork alliance, a storm of humanity gathering strength as it traveled, absorbing the uprooted and the defeated until it became an irresistible force. This transforms them from a mysterious they into a profound symbol of systemic collapse, where the failure of one civilization could send ripples that gathered desperate people from 1,000 miles away, uniting them in a single, devastating wave. Yet the most chilling testament to their power lies not in Egypt's defensive victory, but in the absolute silence that fell over its greatest rival. The Hittite Empire, a superpower that had stood toe-to-toe with pharaohs for centuries, was utterly erased. Its magnificent capital, Hattusa, a fortress city of towering stone walls and grand temples perched in the highlands of Anatolia, was burned and abandoned. One day it was the nerve center of a vast kingdom, the next, a smoldering ruin left to the wind. This was not a mere military defeat or a change in dynasty. It was the death of a civilization. The Hittites vanished as a political force so completely that for thousands of years their very existence was forgotten, remembered only as a vague name in the Bible. Modern archaeologists had to rediscover them entirely, piecing together their history from clay tablets dug from the ashes. How could such a formidable empire simply cease to be? While internal strains like drought and famine certainly weakened its foundations, the evidence points to the Sea Peoples as the final, devastating blow. Hattusa was hundreds of miles from the sea, so how did seafarers reach it? The answer reveals the strategic horror of this crisis. The Sea Peoples did not need to sack the capital themselves. By swarming the coastline, they severed the Hittites from their lifelines. They choked off the vital seaborne trade in grain and metals that fed the empire's economy and armies. They may have even allied with restless subject peoples or internal rebels within the Hittite realm, turning a foreign invasion into a catastrophic civil collapse. The result was a power vacuum of staggering scale. Where once a centralized authority enforced treaties and laws written in its own unique script, there was now only fragments, scattered city-states, and a profound silence. The Hittite language, once the tongue of diplomats and kings, fell out of use and was forgotten. Their legal codes, their religious rituals, their entire administrative system, it all faded into the soil. This erasure is what separates the Bronze Age collapse from a simple period of war. It was a reset. The disappearance of the Hittites shows us that the crisis did not just topple governments. It obliterated whole worlds of knowledge and order, leaving the map of the Near East blank for new peoples to draw. Even for the victors, the price of survival was ruinously high. Egypt's pharaohs Merneptah and later Ramesses III succeeded where other empires had failed. They turned back the invaders in a series of desperate land and sea battles, victories they proclaimed as divine triumphs on their temple walls. But these carvings of glory hide a deeper, more sobering truth. The effort to save the kingdom bled it dry. Mobilizing the army and navy on such a scale year after year consumed an unimaginable fortune. The royal treasury, once filled with gold from Nubia and tribute from vassal kingdoms, was emptied to feed, arm, and pay the soldiers defending the Nile. This financial strain cracked the very foundation of pharaonic power. To reward his military commanders and keep the army loyal, Ramesses III was forced to grant them vast tracts of land and unprecedented autonomy, effectively creating a new class of regional warlords whose power began to rival that of the crown in distant Thebes. The central authority of the pharaoh, the god-king who had unified the two lands for centuries, was irreparably weakened from within. Meanwhile, the world outside had crumbled. The economic networks that had been Egypt's lifeblood were gone. The profitable trade with the Hittites for Anatolian silver, the exchange of Egyptian grain for Cypriot copper and Aegean oils, all of it vanished when those partner civilizations collapsed or fell into chaos. The great ports of the Levant, where Egyptian merchants had operated for generations, were now either destroyed or held by new, unfamiliar peoples like the Philistines. Egypt found itself suddenly isolated, an island of stability in a sea of ruins, but an island that was now much poorer and more vulnerable. So while the monuments shout of victory, the historical record whispers of decline. The era of massive pyramid construction and far-flung military campaigns was over. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses III ruled a diminished realm, increasingly focused on internal matters and temple rituals rather than imperial ambitions. Egypt's golden age of the Bronze Age had ended. Its survival came at the cost of its greatness, a slow retreat from the world stage. This is the ultimate lesson of the crisis. In a systemic collapse, there are no true winners, only degrees of loss. The Sea Peoples did not have to conquer Egypt to defeat it. The sheer cost of resisting them, both in wealth and in social cohesion, degraded the kingdom just as surely as any sacked city. The entire regional system, that interconnected web of empires, was pulled down together, proving that when the foundations of a world are shaken, even those who remain standing are left in a profoundly different and diminished landscape. And then they were gone. After the reign of Ramesses III in the early 12th century before the Common Era, the terrifying confederation known as the Sea Peoples simply dissolves from history. No more grand battles are recorded against them. No more frantic letters describe their fleets. They vanish from the written record as abruptly as they arrived, leaving behind only smoldering ruins, a reshaped map, and this fifth great mystery. What happened to them after the storm passed? The most straightforward answer is that many, like the Peliset we now call the Philistines, simply stopped being invaders and became neighbors. They settled down, they built cities, farmed the land, intermarried with local populations, and over generations, their distinct identity blurred into the cultural tapestry of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their unique pottery styles were gradually replaced. Their languages were forgotten in favor of local tongues. They assimilated, their story ending not in dramatic defeat, but in the quiet, everyday process of building a new home. For these groups, the era of the Sea Peoples was a traumatic, defining migration, after which they became just another people in a crowded land. But what of the other names on the Egyptian lists, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh? Some may have met less peaceful ends. The world that emerged from the collapse was a fractured, violent place for centuries, a dark age of smaller kingdoms and incessant local warfare. It is entirely possible that some bands were destroyed in later conflicts, defeated and absorbed by rising powers, or simply fading away through hardship and dispersal. Their legacy would be no grand city, but perhaps a new style of sword adopted by their conquerors, or a story of fierce warriors that lingered in local legend. Yet there is a third, more profound possibility. Perhaps the Sea Peoples did not disappear because they were defeated, but because the world that created them ceased to exist. Remember the driving force behind their movement, that prolonged drought and systemic collapse. As the climate eventually stabilized, as the long crisis of the 12th century receded into memory, the desperate pressures that had sent entire populations fleeing their homelands began to ease. New political structures slowly coalesced from the ashes, like the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which established a harsh but effective new order across the region. In this new world, there was no fertile ground for a vast, roaming confederation of the displaced. The conditions that had turned farmers into pirates and refugees into an army were gone. So they may have simply stopped being sea peoples. The label was never one they gave themselves. It was a name given by the empires they terrified. When the terror ended, the name lost its meaning. They became once again just people scattered across dozens of new communities from Sicily to the Levant. This disappearance is their final, fitting enigma. They are forever frozen in history as agents of catastrophic change, a flash of lightning that illuminated the fragility of an age before vanishing back into the dark. They have no epilogue because their story was absorbed into the beginning of so many others, leaving us with a haunting silhouette, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful forces in history are those that arrive from the unknown, reshape everything in their path, and then melt back into the stream of time, anonymous once more. The stones themselves tell a story of fire and sudden silence. Across the ancient world, from the bustling port of Ugarit on the Syrian coast to the legendary citadel of Troy in the west, archaeologists peel back the layers of earth and find a single, haunting horizon. It is a band of blackened soil, a thick stratum of ash and charcoal, shattered mud brick and toppled stone. This is the destruction layer, and it is consistently dated to around the year 1200 before the Common Era. It is a scar in the earth, a physical timestamp of catastrophe. At Ugarit, a vibrant trading hub, excavations revealed a city frozen in its final moments. Cuneiform tablets lay in the ruins of administrative buildings, some bearing frantic, unfinished messages about enemy ships sighted offshore. The city's defenses were breached, its grand structures burned, and the evidence suggests its people had no time to properly care for their loved ones before the end. This layer is not an isolated tragedy. It appears at Mycenaean palaces in Greece, at Hittite outposts in Anatolia, and at Canaanite cities in the Levant. It forms a chilling archaeological chorus, a synchronized echo of collapse across hundreds of miles. What lies above this dark line is equally revealing. In the layers of earth deposited after the fires cooled, the material culture, the everyday objects left behind by the people who came next, is often starkly different. The sophisticated, wheel-made pottery painted with intricate designs gives way to cruder, hand-made wares with simpler geometric patterns. The sprawling, multi-room palaces and complex administrative centers are not rebuilt. Instead, communities construct smaller, simpler dwellings, and perhaps most telling of all, the written word vanishes. In Greece, the linear B script used for palace inventories disappears. In Anatolia, Hittite cuneiform falls silent. For centuries in many of these regions, society continues without any form of writing, a profound step backward in complexity. This dramatic shift is the archaeological definition of a dark age, a period where technological and cultural knowledge was lost. To attribute every one of these destruction layers solely to the Sea Peoples would be an oversimplification. This was an era of perfect storms where internal rebellion, economic strain, and possibly even localized conflicts all played a part. Yet the widespread geographical pattern is impossible to ignore. A common thread of violent disruption was pulling at the fabric of the age. The Sea Peoples, as a major vector of that disruption, left their mark not in written histories of their own, but in this universal archaeological signature of burning cities and cultural amnesia. They were the human embodiment of a system-wide failure, and the ground beneath our feet still bears the brutal, undeniable proof of their passage. This brings us to a sixth and deeply puzzling layer of the mystery. Their terrifying effectiveness forces a difficult question. How were they organized? The synchronized strikes against two superpowers, the Hittite Empire and Egypt, from both land and sea, suggest more than a mindless stampede. It implies a chilling degree of coordination, of shared intelligence and timing. Yet, in all the Egyptian inscriptions that name the enemy tribes, not a single commander is ever mentioned. No proud pharaoh boasts of capturing a rival king or a great admiral from among the Sea Peoples. Their leadership is a ghost in the historical machine. So what are we to make of this? One possibility is that they were led by a council of equals, a gathering of chieftains from the different groups, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, who made strategic decisions together. In this model, their unity was pragmatic, a temporary alliance forged for survival and conquest, with no single figure rising to dominate the others. Their shared goal of securing new lands provided enough common purpose to coordinate complex campaigns without needing a supreme leader. This kind of fluid, coalition-based warfare would have been alien and disorienting to the rigid, hierarchical empires they faced, making them even harder to predict or counter. Another, more haunting possibility is that their very lack of a traditional command structure was their greatest strength. The collapse that birthed them had shattered the old world's social order. Kings, generals, and priests, the usual figures of authority, had failed their people. What emerged from the ashes was not a new kingdom, but a new kind of force, driven by a collective, desperate energy. Imagine not an army with a chain of command, but a vast, moving society. Decisions on where to go next might have been made by a consensus of elders, or simply by following the most successful warrior bands, a form of organic, emergent leadership that shifted with circumstances. Their objective was starkly simple: find fertile land and a safe harbor. Every action, every coordinated assault served that singular, survivalist logic. This absence of a named leader does more than deepen their mystique. It fundamentally changes how we understand the nature of the Bronze Age collapse. This was not a war between known empires with known rulers. It was a systemic failure so complete that it birthed a form of human movement that defied contemporary understanding. The Sea Peoples may represent the breakdown of civilization itself, reorganized into a desperate, migratory wave. They were a symptom of a world where the old rules no longer applied, where the very concept of a king leading his people had been replaced by the raw, collective will to live. Their silent leadership is perhaps the most telling clue of all, pointing not to a hidden genius, but to a profound historical truth, that when the foundations of order crumble, humanity can reorganize in unpredictable and overwhelmingly powerful ways. The names left behind by the Egyptians are more than a list of enemies. They are a linguistic echo waiting to be deciphered. For over a century, scholars have pored over these syllables: Peliset, Shekelesh, Denyen, treating them not as historical footnotes, but as cryptic place names whispered across 3,000 years. Each name is a potential map, a clue to a lost homeland. The work is painstaking, comparing these ancient terms to words and place names from other languages and cultures that emerged after the collapse. For example, the name Peliset bears a striking resemblance to Pelasgian, a term used by later Greek writers to describe the mysterious, pre-Greek inhabitants of the Aegean region. Could the Peliset have been survivors from that earlier Aegean world, carrying its name with them as they sailed east? Similarly, the Denyen sound remarkably like the Danaoi, one of the names Homer uses for the Greeks in his epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. This connection paints a vivid picture, suggesting bands of displaced Mycenaean warriors, their great halls in ashes, taking to the seas under a name their descendants would later celebrate in legend. Even the Sherden, with their horned helmets, might find a root in Sardinia, while the Shekelesh could point toward Sicily. These are not perfect matches, but they are compelling whispers, linguistic threads that seem to stretch across the entire Mediterranean basin, from the Greek mainland to the Italian islands. Yet for every thread that seems to connect, another phrase. Language is a living, changing thing, and the gap of centuries is vast. An Egyptian scribe, hearing a foreign name for the first time amid the chaos of battle, would have written it down using hieroglyphic sounds that best approximated what he heard. It is like a game of ancient telephone, where the original word passed through the ears of frightened soldiers and the conventions of a foreign writing system before being carved in stone. What we have may be a rough sketch of the true names, not a precise recording. This leaves the linguistic puzzle tantalizingly incomplete. The names suggest a breathtaking diversity, a coalition drawn from the farthest corners of the known world, but they cannot draw us a definitive map. They remind us that our entire knowledge of these peoples is filtered through the perception of those who feared them. The Egyptians may have used broad, generic terms for northerners or islanders, labels that grouped many distinct peoples under a single, frightening banner for the sake of royal propaganda. In the end, the search for their language is a search for their voice, one that remains stubbornly silent, reminding us that history is not just written by the victors, but often about the vanquished, seen through a lens not their own. Perhaps the most devastating loss was not of cities or armies, but of words. In the ashes of the great palaces, something profound and quiet disappeared. The intricate script of the Mycenaean Greeks, called Linear B, vanished. The diplomatic language of the Hittite Empire, its cuneiform pressed into clay tablets, fell silent. Across the region, the art of writing itself retreated, confined for centuries afterward to just a few isolated pockets like Egypt and Mesopotamia. This is the seventh mystery, a cultural blackout that plunged much of the known world into a historical silence. Could the Sea Peoples have been directly responsible for this intellectual catastrophe? It is unlikely they sought out scribes and burned libraries with deliberate intent. Their goal was grain, metal, and land, not the erasure of knowledge, but the effect was the same. By toppling the palatial systems, they destroyed the very infrastructure that made writing necessary and possible. Think of it this way: Linear B was not used for poetry or history. The tablets we have found are almost entirely inventories, lists of chariot wheels, distributions of wool, and records of offerings to the gods. It was the bureaucratic software of a complex, centralized economy. When the palaces that employed these scribes were burned, when the tax collectors had no more grain to count, and the royal warehouses stood empty, the profession itself became obsolete. The scribe, once a valued administrator, was now a man with a useless skill in a world that had reverted to local subsistence. Writing was not just forgotten, it was abandoned as a luxury that a shattered society could no longer afford. This loss created the very conditions that make the Sea Peoples so mysterious to us today. We are trying to reconstruct their story from the perspective of the few civilizations that kept records, like Egypt, and from the silent testimony of archaeology. The other side of the story, the experiences and perspectives of the displaced peoples themselves, is lost because the systems that could have recorded them were swept away. They symbolize, therefore, something even deeper than political collapse. They represent a rupture in humanity's collective memory, a regression where the hard-won tool of recorded history was set aside for generations. The darkness that followed their passing was not merely one of violence, but of forgetting, making their true impact echo far louder in the empty spaces they left behind than in any list of battles won or lost. Their story is ultimately one of profound fragility. The saga of the Sea Peoples offers more than a thrilling mystery. it provides a stark case study in how the most advanced and interconnected societies can unravel. Think of the late Bronze Age world as a magnificent, intricate machine. Its parts were the specialized kingdoms, the long-distance trade routes, the diplomatic letters between kings, and the shared technologies of chariot warfare and palace administration. For centuries, this machine hummed along, creating immense wealth and cultural splendor. But its very complexity became its greatest weakness. Each part was dependent on the others. The Hittites needed Egyptian grain in a bad year. The Mycenaeans relied on Cypriot copper for their bronze, and everyone depended on the stability of the sea lanes. When multiple pressures converged, the entire system seized. The environmental stress of prolonged drought was the first critical failure, straining resources and sowing discontent. Internal social and economic decay likely followed, as palaces overtaxed their people and rivalries festered. The Sea Peoples then became the external shock, the final hammer blow that shattered a structure already cracked from within. This reveals a sobering truth. Advanced technology, vast trade networks, and mighty armies are not absolute guarantees of survival. They can create a kind of rigid stability that is spectacularly vulnerable when the foundations shift. A civilization can be like a towering castle built on sand, magnificent to behold but perilously dependent on conditions it cannot control. This ancient event holds up an unsettling mirror to our own world. We live in an era of profound globalization where supply chains stretch across continents, economies are deeply interlinked, and information travels at the speed of light. Our complexity and interconnectedness are our greatest achievements, yet they also create new kinds of risk. The story of the Sea Peoples prompts us to consider our modern vulnerabilities. How would our systems withstand a similar convergence of stresses? A perfect storm of climate disruptions affecting global agriculture, political instability in key regions, and the sudden movement of displaced populations on an immense scale. Their saga is a timeless warning about the delicate, often invisible balance upon which any civilization is built. It reminds us that resilience may depend less on the height of our towers and more on the flexibility of our foundations, and on our ability to adapt when the world we have built suddenly changes around us. 3,000 years later, the shadow of those strange sails still falls across our stories. In the modern world, the Sea Peoples have found a second life, not in stone carvings, but in the vibrant realms of video games, novels, and blockbuster films. They are reimagined as the ultimate ancient apocalyptic threat, a faceless, overwhelming horde emerging from the mist to topple civilizations. This portrayal taps into something deep within our collective psyche. With no clear homeland or language of their own, they become a perfect blank canvas. We project onto them our own timeless anxieties about barbarians at the gate, about societal collapse, and about the terrifying idea of being overrun by an unknown other. A strategy game might cast them as an unstoppable late-game disaster, sweeping across the map to test a player's empire. A novel might explore them through the eyes of an Egyptian scribe, embodying the sheer chaos that threatens an ordered world. While these interpretations often simplify the complex climate-driven reality we now understand, they serve a vital purpose. They keep the mystery electrically alive, pulling it from dusty academic journals and introducing its epic scale to entirely new generations. This pop culture fascination is more than just entertainment. It is a form of modern myth-making. It shows how history's greatest unknowns continue to fuel our creativity, prompting us to reflect on the very themes the Sea Peoples represent: identity in the face of the other, the causes of conflict, and the raw human will to endure. By wrestling with their story in our art, we are, in a way, still trying to answer that fundamental question carved at Medinet Habu: who were these people, and what does their terrifying journey tell us about ourselves? But the most direct witnesses to this lost world may not be in the sands of Egypt or the hills of Anatolia. They lie silent on the dark seafloor. An eighth mystery is now being explored in the hushed, weightless realm of underwater archaeology. Here, far from the boastful carvings of pharaohs, the Mediterranean itself holds time capsules from the Age of Collapse. While no confirmed Sea People's worship has yet been found, discoveries from slightly earlier periods offer breathtaking context. Take the Uluburan shipwreck discovered off the southern coast of Turkey. This vessel, which sank around 1300 before the Common Era, was a floating treasure chest of Bronze Age globalization. Its cargo held 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, Canaanite jewelry, Mycenaean pottery, ebony from Africa, and even a gold scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. This single wreck paints a vivid portrait of the intricate, far-flung trade network that was the lifeblood of that era, the very system that would soon fracture. Finding a ship from the Sea Peoples themselves would be the archaeological equivalent of striking gold. Such a discovery would be revolutionary. Instead of seeing these mariners through the fearful eyes of their enemies, we could meet them on their own terms. The design of the hull, the style of its anchors, and the wear on its oarlocks would tell us about their shipbuilding technology and seafaring capabilities. The cargo would speak volumes. Were they carrying precious metals and looted treasures, or the humble, practical goods of a migrating community, seed grain, tools, and household items? Personal belongings, a comb, a piece of jewelry, or a unique tool, could offer a glimpse of their daily lives and cultural affiliations, potentially pointing decisively to a homeland. This is the exciting frontier of the search. It underscores a crucial point: the mystery of the Sea Peoples is not a closed book, it is an active investigation. Researchers are now surveying seabeds near known conflict zones and migration routes, using advanced sonar and robotic submersibles to scan for anomalies that could be a 3,000-year-old hull. The potential is staggering to think that a single storm, a single naval engagement, could have sent a vessel to the deep, preserving a frozen moment from the heart of the crisis. The story of these elusive mariners, therefore, is still being written. Each season of diving holds the promise that the next signal on a sonar screen could be the one that finally pulls a ghost ship from the shadows, ready to whisper its secrets after millennia of silence. This search for answers inevitably leads us into a fog of modern myth. The silence surrounding the Sea Peoples has been filled not just by scholarly theories, but by captivating, often misleading speculation. It is crucial now to separate the solid ground of archaeological evidence from the seductive quicksand of romantic fiction. First and foremost, there is absolutely no evidence that the Sea Peoples were a single, unified lost tribe with a secret homeland like Atlantis. This idea, while thrilling, belongs to the realm of fantasy, not history. Similarly, the notion that they wielded some form of advanced or exotic technology that gave them an edge is unsupported by the facts. The carvings at Medinet Habu show them using weapons and ships that, while formidable, were well within the technological understanding of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. Another persistent myth is that they were the harbingers of the Iron Age, sweeping in with superior iron swords to slash through bronze-armored armies. This is a dramatic oversimplification. The transition from bronze to iron was a slow, complex process driven by the collapse of the tin and copper trade networks, not a sudden military innovation. While small, precious iron items existed, they were ceremonial luxuries. The Sea Peoples almost certainly fought with the same bronze weapons and armor used by the empires they confronted. Their advantage was not better metal, but perhaps better desperation, mobility, and the overwhelming pressure of their numbers and timing. Understanding this shifts our entire perspective. It moves us away from the image of a mysterious, superhuman force and toward a more human, and in many ways more tragic, reality. They were not a magical cause of the collapse, they were a devastating symptom of it, and then a powerful accelerator. They were the spark that landed in a pile of dry tinder, a pile that had been gathering for generations due to climate change, economic strain, and political fragility. By critically examining the evidence, we dismantled the simplistic barbarian horde narrative. This was not a story of civilized good versus primitive evil. It was a complex, multi-causal historical event involving real human beings, from pampered pharaohs to starving farmers, all facing existential crises. The sea peoples emerged not as monsters from the deep, but as people caught in the same catastrophic current that was drowning kings, a current of drought, hunger, and systemic failure that reshaped the world. This nuanced view does not make their story less compelling. It makes it profoundly more relevant, reminding us that history's greatest upheavals are rarely about villains and heroes, but about interconnected systems breaking down and the human struggle to survive the wreckage. The chaotic reality of the collapse did not vanish from human memory. It was transformed, echoing down the centuries in the foundational stories of the civilizations that rose from the ashes. The great Greek epics, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, may hold the faintest whispers of this lost world. These tales of a decade-long war against the mighty city of Troy, of heroes like Achilles and Odysseus, are set in a glorious Mycenaean past. Yet the world Homer describes centuries later is one of wandering heroes, sacked cities, and a powerful, nostalgic ache for a lost age of greatness. Scholars suggest these stories could be a cultural memory, a mythologized echo of the very real warfare, migrations, and fallen palaces of the 12th century before the Common Era. The Trojan War may not be a record of a single siege, but a poetic condensation of an entire era of conflict, displacement, and the struggle to return home after everything has changed. It is as if the trauma of the collapse was woven into the very fabric of Greek identity, remembered not as a dry historical fact, but as a timeless saga of pride, loss, and the enduring human spirit. Across the sea, in the Hebrew Bible, we find another powerful resonance. The Philistines, those persistent adversaries of the Israelites, are presented not as mysterious invaders from the sea, but as a settled, formidable people of the coastal plain. Archaeology confirms they were the Peliset, one of the sea peoples groups resettled by Egypt. Their presence in the biblical narrative is a direct literary inheritance from the very migrations we have been tracing. Furthermore, the grand story of the Exodus, of a people fleeing oppression and wandering in search of a promised land, mirrors on a monumental scale the broader theme of the age, the movement of populations. While the Exodus is a foundational religious narrative, its backdrop of displacement and the search for a new beginning may subtly reflect the turbulent, migratory reality of the wider Mediterranean world in that distant century. These are not history books, but they are something perhaps equally profound. They are stories that helped new peoples understand their place in the world, stories that gave meaning to the ruins that dotted their landscapes and the strange neighbors who lived beside them. The raw, chaotic historical event of the Sea Peoples was filtered through generations of oral tradition and cultural identity, slowly hardening into the myths that would define Western civilization. The invaders became giants, the collapsed cities became legendary troves of treasure, and the Great Migration became a divine journey. In this way, the ghost of the Bronze Age collapse never truly left us. It simply learned to speak in the language of epic and scripture, ensuring its shadow would stretch far into the future. Their story is not a unique anomaly in the long arc of human history. To truly grasp the scale of what happened, we can place the Sea Peoples within a larger pattern, a recurring rhythm of movement that has reshaped continents. Centuries later, a similar pressure would build along the northern frontiers of the Roman Empire. As climatic shifts and population pressures mounted in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, entire Germanic peoples like the Visigoths and Vandals began pushing against the imperial borders. They were not a unified army with a single king, but a constellation of tribes, each with its own leaders, driven by a mix of desperation and opportunity. The lure of Rome's wealth and the safety of its provinces proved irresistible, especially as they themselves were being pressured by other groups moving from further east. This was not a simple invasion, it was a great, slow migration that eventually poured into the empire, leading to its political fragmentation in the west. Even later, from the vast steppes of Central Asia, the Mongol expansions under leaders like Genghis Khan demonstrated another form of massive demographic shift, one propelled by military innovation and political unification, but also by environmental factors that pushed nomadic peoples toward settled civilizations. While the contexts differ dramatically, a common thread emerges. These great movements are rarely born from a single cause. They are perfect storms. A changing environment, like a prolonged drought, puts stress on food supplies and livelihoods. This creates internal pressure, often sparking conflict between neighboring groups over dwindling resources. One displaced community then pushes against another, creating a domino effect. Finally, the stark contrast between hardship at home and the perceived prosperity of a neighboring civilization acts as a powerful magnet, pulling the movement in a specific direction. The Sea Peoples in this light become a prototype. They are one of the earliest and most dramatic examples we have of this human phenomenon playing out on an intercontinental scale. Their movement was a precedent, a case study written in fire and ruin, showing how migratory pressure can erase old borders and force the birth of entirely new world orders. By studying these patterns across time, historians build models not to predict the future, but to understand the deep forces that compel humanity to move. It reveals a sobering truth about civilization itself. No society, no matter how grand its monuments or powerful its armies, exists in a vacuum. It is always part of a larger, restless human landscape, forever susceptible to the tides of change that begin, quite often, far beyond its walls. The most intimate clues to their identity may lie not in pottery or poetry, but within the very bones of the people themselves. This is the ninth mystery, one that modern science is only now beginning to unlock. Archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, offers a revolutionary new lens. In theory, scientists could analyze genetic material from skeletal remains found in the destruction layers of cities like Ashkelon, or from the resting places of early Philistine communities. By comparing these ancient genetic markers with those of populations across Europe and the Mediterranean, both ancient and modern, researchers could map ancestry with unprecedented precision. They might identify distinct genetic signatures that appear suddenly in the Levant around 1200 before the Common Era, signatures that point clearly to a population influx from the Aegean, Anatolia, or beyond. This data could trace migration routes not as lines on a map drawn from pottery, but as biological pathways written in human cells. It promises a kind of objective truth, a dataset free from the biases of Egyptian scribes or the fragmented nature of the archaeological record. Imagine being able to say with genetic certainty that the individuals buried in a Philistine cemetery carried ancestry primarily linked to Sardinia, or to the Greek mainland, or to a mix of several regions. This would transform the entire puzzle, moving us from speculative connections based on similar-looking parts to direct biological evidence of movement and mixture. Of course, the path is not simple. The hot, dry climate of the eastern Mediterranean can degrade delicate DNA over millennia, making recovery difficult. There are also profound ethical considerations regarding the study of human remains from the past, requiring the utmost respect and careful collaboration with modern communities. Yet, as techniques improve, the potential grows. This emerging field does not seek to replace archaeology or history, but to weave a new thread into the tapestry. It offers a chance to hear from the sea peoples in a language they never wrote down, the silent code of their own ancestry, waiting in the earth to finally tell us where their long, desperate journey began. This economic web was the true lifeblood of the age, a system more vital than any single fortress wall. The great empires were not self-sufficient, they were specialists in a vast, interdependent network. Anatolia provided silver, Cyprus supplied copper, and tin traveled from as far away as Afghanistan to be alloyed into bronze, the essential metal for weapons, tools, and prestige objects. Grain from Egypt and the Levant fed cities, while luxury goods like ivory, glass, and fine textiles cemented alliances between kings. This was not mere commerce, it was the foundational economy of civilization itself, a delicate balance maintained by trust, treaty, and the safe passage of ships. When the sea people surged across the coastline, they did not just attack cities, they attacked this system at its weakest points. Ports like Ugarit, the bustling hubs where goods were transferred from sea to land routes, were among the first to fall. Shipping lanes became perilous, then impassable. Imagine the ripple effect. A Mycenaean palace awaiting a shipment of Cypriot copper for its armorers finds the docks empty. A Hittite administrator counting on Egyptian grain to offset a poor harvest receives only silence. The physical destruction was catastrophic, but the economic paralysis that followed was a slower, deeper poison. Suddenly, the raw materials needed for everything from farming tools to royal inscriptions became scarce or vanished entirely. The value of existing stockpiles would have skyrocketed, creating crippling inflation. A single bronze ingot might become worth a fortune, but fortunes themselves were becoming meaningless as the entire concept of standardized value, tied to that international trade, dissolved. The collapse went beyond mere scarcity, it shattered a language of power. The elite gift exchange system was the diplomatic engine of the Bronze Age. Kings referred to each other as brothers, and they proved it through a constant flow of lavish presents, gold, chariots, skilled artisans. These gifts were not simple generosity, they were binding contracts, tokens of friendship that ensured military support and preferential trade terms. When the ships stopped sailing, this entire performative language of diplomacy broke down. A pharaoh could no longer send a statue to a Hittite king to reaffirm their alliance because the route was swarming with hostile ships and the king might no longer even be there. The trust built over generations evaporated almost overnight. This economic and diplomatic unraveling demonstrates a profound historical truth. The sea people's most lasting damage may not have been measured in burned temples, but in broken contracts and empty warehouses. They targeted the infrastructure of society, the invisible networks of exchange and obligation that made empire possible. By making the seas a no-go zone, they did not have to conquer every city inland, they simply starved the system of its essential connections. A kingdom could survive a lost battle, but it could not survive being cut off from the tin needed for its soldiers' weapons or the grain needed to feed its people. In this way, their galleys acted like scissors, snipping the intricate threads that held the grand tapestry of the late Bronze Age together. The resulting picture was not just one of political fragmentation, but of a world thrust back into local isolation, where every community was suddenly forced to rely solely on what it could produce within walking distance, a devastating step backward in human complexity and cooperation. For the Egyptians, the sea itself was a realm of primal terror. While their world was defined by the benevolent, predictable Nile with its life-giving floods and fertile banks, the Mediterranean represented something utterly alien, a churning, saltwater abyss of storms and unseen monsters. In their cosmology, this was the domain of the chaos serpent, the enemy of creation, forever held at bay by the pharaoh's divine power. So when a nameless armada emerged from that very abyss, it was not just a military threat, it was a metaphysical nightmare made flesh. The invaders were not merely foreigners, They were the living embodiment of the chaotic force that constantly threatened to swallow the ordered world of Egypt whole. This symbolic framing is our 10th and perhaps most revealing mystery, for it colors every single record we have of them. The carvings at Medinet Habu are not just battle reports, they are ritual dramas. The pharaoh is shown not only as a commander, but as a god-king reenacting the eternal victory of order over chaos. The sea peoples, in their strange ships and exotic garb, are cast in the role of the chaotic serpent's minions. Their defeat is presented as a cosmic necessity, a reaffirmation of the universe's proper balance. This is why we get no nuanced portraits, no sense of their internal motives or humanity. To grant them that would be to legitimize the chaos they represented. They had to be the perfect, monstrous other. This cultural lens is crucial for us, the modern audience, to understand. It reminds us with startling clarity that our primary sources are not neutral windows into the past. They are carefully constructed narratives designed to serve a theological and political purpose. The Egyptians were writing the history of their own salvation, and in that story, the sea peoples could only ever play one role, the faceless enemy from the deep. For 3,000 years, that has been their defining image, a shadow cast by the triumphant light of pharaonic propaganda. This invites a profound and unsettling question. How is history written in the wake of catastrophe? The survivors, those who endure the storm, are the ones who pick up the pen. They write to explain the trauma, to justify their survival, and to rebuild a sense of meaning from the ruins. The story that emerges is inevitably one that centers their own resilience and frames the disruptive force as an external, almost elemental evil. The complex human realities of the displaced, the starving, the desperate migrants who made up the Great Migration are erased, replaced by a symbolic monster. In seeing the sea peoples through this Egyptian lens, we are challenged to look beyond it, to listen for the silences in the record. It asks us to consider how our own histories of crisis and conflict might be shaped by the perspectives of those who endured to tell the tale, and what voices, what human complexities might be forever lost in that telling. The mystery, then, is not just who they were, but how the fear they inspired forever crystallized their memory into a symbol, obscuring the multifaceted truth of a people caught in history's great current. The story of the sea peoples is a ghost story written in ash and silence. Across this journey, we have walked the scorched earth of their passage, from the boastful stone of Egyptian temples to the shattered pottery of forgotten ports. We have sifted through theories of their origins, from Aegean refugees to a desperate confederation of the displaced, and traced the terrifying scale of their impact, which toppled empires and erased languages from memory. Yet for all our searching, they remain just beyond the light, their true voices lost to the deep. This enduring mystery is not a failure of history, but its most profound lesson. It reminds us that the grandest human achievements, the palaces, the trade networks, the written word, are not permanent. They are agreements, delicate and sustained, that can dissolve under the pressure of a changing climate, a broken supply line, or the arrival of strangers on the shore. The sea peoples did not just end the Bronze Age, they revealed its fragility. In their wake, a darker, simpler world emerged, one that would slowly, painfully, build itself anew from the fragments. Their legacy is that of the ultimate catalyst, the human wave that marked the violent turning of an age. They stand as a timeless echo, asking us to look at our own interconnected world and consider what unseen threads hold it together and what forces might one day pull them apart. The search for their story is far from over. Every dive to a shipwreck, every scrape of an archaeologist's trowel, every sequenced strand of ancient DNA brings us closer to the people behind the legend. What do you think is the most compelling clue to their identity? Share your perspective on this ancient enigma below, and subscribe to join us as we continue to explore history's greatest puzzles, where every answer reveals a deeper mystery.